Once you've installed failover clustering and you begin the process of creating a new cluster, the first thing you'll be asked to do is validate your configuration. There is a wizard built in that actually guides you through this process. Now, all this does is run a bunch of tests just to make sure you have all the components, you have everything you need to actually support running a cluster. You run this before you actually create your cluster. Now, after you create the cluster, you can come back and rerun this anytime you want. It's recommended that if you make any changes to the cluster, you add additional storage, you add a new node to the cluster, recommended that you rerun this anytime you make those types of changes. Now, when I initially run this cluster validation, it's going to make sure your cluster is working properly. Now, we've not created a new cluster at this point, but you have installed the failover cluster feature. So it just makes sure it's running on all the servers in your cluster, that all the servers can communicate with each other. So that'll really be part of the network infrastructure requirement. It makes sure you don't have any hardware or configuration issues. Now, that typically ties into, well, hardware itself and storage. It can run diagnostic tests. So if this cannot connect to a certain component, it'll directly tell you any errors or warnings that exist, and it'll give you a link where you can try to remediate some of those issues. Just provides additional guidance, really. It'll make sure you meet the software requirements. That's really just OS and failover, that feature on all your nodes in the cluster. When you begin creating your cluster, we have to verify we meet the prerequisites. If you install this through the GUI, one of the prerequisites is that you are domain joined. By default, all the servers in your cluster have to be joined to an Active Directory domain. If they are not, you can still configure a cluster, but they will refer to it as an Active Directory detached cluster, and you can only set it up through PowerShell. You cannot go through the interface and set it up in the GUI because you can't. Just no rhyme or reason as to why that is, just the way Microsoft designed this. It will fail to create your cluster if you do it in the GUI if your server is in a workgroup. A footnote, in addition to being domain joined, it cannot be a domain controller. Now, that's not something you would ever do, but just a fact. This I find only important like in my test lab. So if you really want to build a 2-node failover cluster, then truly you need to have like a virtual machine that's a domain controller. Then you would have to have 2 other servers to create a full failover cluster. Now, you can have one server, like in a lab environment, install the failover cluster feature, and you can go through the entire configuration on one server. You just know you have no server to fail over to. So one is fine just for learning how it actually works. Install the failover cluster feature on each node in the server. Now, you'll do that. So if these are both of my nodes, you install failover cluster on both nodes. You can do that at the same time. Then we have that validated configuration wizard. Then we create the cluster. When I do that, I can use the graphical tool, or you can use the Windows Admin Center, or PowerShell would be an option as well. Then you create the clustered role. Now, what's great about this, I install failover clustering. I'm going to say FC on both of these servers. So my cluster is created. Once it's created, I just go to one of these machines and I define the clustered role. Now, that'll be something like a file server, whatever it is you want to be highly available. You only configure that one time, and it's shared between the other nodes in the cluster. So it's not as if I have to go to each server and add the clustered role or anything like that. You just do that one time on whichever node you want, and it shares that configuration with all the other nodes in the cluster. For storage, we have quite a few options. We can use SAS or serial attached storage. That's just a type of drive. We can use an iSCSI. It's also just a type of storage. You can use fiber channel. We can also use virtual hard drive, these shared VHDX files. Very common is to use storage spaces. We discussed those in an earlier module when we created the storage pools, and then we could break up that space however we needed. that is a valid option to be your cluster storage volume. But whatever you choose, just remember that you have to have centralized storage for the failover cluster to actually function. On the network side, all network hardware must be compatible with Windows Server. Now, as weird as this sounds, they mean network hardware, not server hardware. Server hardware would be network adapters and those types of components. They mean like switches. I don't believe anyone ever thinks of operating system compatibility when they think of something like a switch. But if you look through the data sheet you get like with a Cisco switch, it will tell you that this product is certified for server 2012, 2016, 2019. Now, any switch you get is going to pass this traffic, so that's almost a formality. But Microsoft always lists that as one of the requirements. The network infrastructure that connects your nodes must not have a single point of failure. So that would mean having dual network adapters, dual switches in your environment. Just as you look at your layout, there can be no point that you could have one thing fail and your entire cluster goes offline. If that's true, you do not have true high availability. When you configure the cluster, we can manage this fail over and fail back. Now, these concepts control how your cluster responds. So one of the things you can define that's pretty neat is this preferred owners. So you're going to have more than one server in your cluster, well, two or more. You can define who the preferred owner is for a specific role. So let's say I'm building a file server cluster. I prefer node A to run my file server cluster. I'll just say you're the preferred owner. Your others would be considered possible owners, which means if a preferred owner fails, then the other server could run this. You can even define these in a list and have multiple preferred owners. Ultimately, what this would allow you to do is to control the order that a role will run on nodes. So it runs on node A. If node A fails, it runs on node B, then runs on node C. You can carve that process out so it won't just be random to say, if you have, say, a 3-node cluster, it won't be random that if this server fails, it'll pick either one. You could have a preferred list that it actually goes down. One way to think of that, I could have a 3-node cluster. I could have this be my preferred file server. So that's a file server in your cluster. This could be a web server. I could have this node B, we'll call it, be a file server and also be a web server. So what can happen now? This is my preferred owner and my file server runs on node A. My preferred web server is node C. This node B is not preferred for any role. It is simply a possible owner. So what that means, this server is passive all the time. If my file server fails, then node B steps in and delivers files. If node C fails, it steps in and delivers web traffic. Now, it's unlikely that node A and C fail at exactly the same time, so we probably will not have node B run your file and web server at exactly the same time, but it lets me reduce my hardware cost because now you have one server that is servicing both of these cluster roles, but only as a backup if the preferred servers actually fail. There's not really a big configuration for failback, but what we can define is the number of times the cluster service can restart in a set period. And I can also set things like how many times can you fail back in a certain amount of time. So I could say, if my node fails, you can only fail back 2 times in 1 hour. If it fails a 3rd time, then it keeps running on the other node. So if I have a server that's hung in like an endless set of reboots or something like that, I don't want to keep failing over and failing back. So you could just limit over whatever time period. Maybe you say you can only fail back twice in a 24-hour period, just whatever you believe is appropriate. You can also say, once you fail over, never fail back automatically. I have to come in and see why it failed over to begin with, and then I have to manually fail it back. So that's an option as well.